Jekyll and Hyde, Chapter 1, a recap. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages. His friends were those of his own blood, or those of whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. Here we see a Victorian gentleman. It's really important that Utterson is the first character we meet, because he's a lawyer and he's about following the rules. This novel, partly, is about what happens when people don't follow the rules of society. Utterson seems a dull man. He was never lighted by a smile. He was cold and embarrassed and backward. He seems to keep himself to himself. And yet the last word in quotation 1 suggests there's something nice about him after all. He is lovable. In quotation 2, we see the idea of being austere with himself, of taking life seriously and not just drinking in private, throwing expensive parties, but living the way you're supposed to. In quotation 3, we see the importance of friendship in the book. His friends were those of his own blood, people he's related to, or those he'd known the longest. So for him, friendship is important and he keeps it going. And then the simile, his affections like ivy were the growth of time, makes it seem as though friendship is something natural, something that grows. Utterson meets his friend Enfield, and Enfield, while they're out walking, points out a door. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. This is the first time we see the idea that London has two sides, and we see the big division between rich and poor. And this particular door seems to symbolise secrecy. It has no bell or knocker, there seems to be no way in, and it's not well cared for. But it's just around the corner from an expensive area. "Did you ever remark that door?" Enfield asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" This is the moment where the two men realise that they both know half a strange story about Dr. Henry Jekyll. And then Enfield begins to tell the story. The man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her, screaming, on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. This is where we're first introduced to Mr. Hyde, who is seen as a small man, but the verb trampled seems to suggest that he moves with the weight and the power of some animals, almost like the stampeding elephants. The adverb calmly makes it seem as though he doesn't care as he crushes this child. Words like screaming and hellish seem to suggest the evilness of what he does. The idea of a juggernaut is a large, unmovable, unstoppable creature, and the adjective damned reminds us that this is a man who is already going to hell. There couldn't be a bigger difference here between the first man we met in the novel, Mr. Utterson. Enfield continues, "Yes, it's a bad story, for my man was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man, and the person that drew the cheque is the very pink of proprieties, celebrated too. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth." Edward Hyde pays off the family of the girl he tramples with a cheque signed by Dr. Jekyll. Here we see the idea of reputation, the idea that the man who signed the cheque would never in real life have anything to do with such a man as Edward Hyde. And Enfield makes the assumption that it's blackmail, that Dr. Jekyll, when he was young, did something silly, and he's now keeping his reputation by paying for that. Here there is an expectation from Enfield that young men would have done silly things, that there are capers in his youth. Capers suggests a fun or a silly prank. However, Enfield treats Hyde very differently. "I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I can make no hand of it. I can't describe him." This is the first time we get the sense that Hyde is someone you can see is evil, and yet you don't know why. The repetition of the word deformed suggests there's something out of shape, something wrong about the man, and they all seem to find it difficult to describe him, almost as though he's hardly real. And that theme continues through the novel, that there is something mysterious and unhuman about Hyde.